the issues that you are going to raise, except that I'll be able to raise it in Parliament and put some moral and political pressure and take your voice to the people who don't want to listen to your voice. So, I mean, with that caveat, let's make this interactive session. I'll just make a couple of comments because there's been a lot of talk about the national forest policy. There's a lot of misapprehensions and people have mistaken impressions of what this national forest policy is. Ram Guha wrote a column saying the national forest policy must be stopped. And I had to send him an email saying that it cannot be stopped because it doesn't come to Parliament. It's an executive decision. It's a national forest policy. It's an announcement of the government of the day. Like the national forest policy was announced in 1988, the national forest policy has been announced in 2018. And like all policies that are announced by all governments, any resemblance between the policy and reality is purely coincidental. So I don't think you guys should get all head up about it. It gives a broad direction. It's not legislation. That's what I want you to understand. It's not legislation. So it's the Forest Conservation Act remains as it is, the Forest Rights Act remains as it is. The National Forest Policy gives some idea of the government's thinking on forest policy. And I think the suggestion I had made to Ram and a couple of others who had approached me was that I think civil society must raise its voice on 3 or 4 of the more pernicious elements of the national forest policy, because they could well form part of decisions that the government might take. For example, the leasing out of degraded forest lands to private industry, which really opens up the doors for privatizing many of our forests in the name of improving the quality of our forests. So that's the comment I want to make on the national forest policy. On environment itself, Mr. T.S.R. Subramaniam, whom I had worked with very closely many years ago, may his soul rest in peace, passed away very recently, told me that he had been asked to write this report, and it's very interesting that after he submitted his report, Mr. Subramaniam started writing a lot of newspaper articles that went against the T.S.R. Subramaniam committee report. So I called up Mr. Subramaniam and I said, sir, I mean, I've heard of people changing avatars, but this is something quite remarkable, because he had written a piece in the newspaper arguing against GM mustard. And the T.S.R. Subramaniam committee was an indictment of the decision to put a moratorium on BT brinjal. So he turned around to me and he said, no, this government doesn't know anything. It's in the grip of Monsanto and it wants to introduce all genetically modified crops and so on and so forth. So, every sinner has a future. And T.S.R. Subramaniam. Hi, Rajiv. Come. I told our friend Leo that he should tell congressman to come on time.
It's election season, sir. You're far away in Delhi.
Election season?
Yeah, we're doing too many things.
Yeah, one of the things that you must do on election is actually come on time,
Yes.
Good. So I'm just saying, Leo had a sort of an opening thing, and I'm just making some opening remarks to make it more interactive. So on the national forest policy, the point is that it's not legislation, it's policy. On the Subramaniam Committee report, it's true that it had called for a substantial dilution of environmental laws and greater self-regulation on the part of industry, but that mercifully has not happened. The next step of actually diluting the laws has not happened. So I think, even though the government may appear to be insensitive, I don't think it can afford to ignore voices coming from different parts of the country. And if there is a critical mass of these voices, I'm pretty sure that governments will listen. I mean, for example, on the CAMPA, on the whole CAMPA debate on the CAMPA guidelines, there's been a lot of going back and forth between civil society and the government. And I think the government has been showing some degree of flexibility, both in Parliament and outside. So one should take some of these issues and certainly make them a very important element of public discourse with the government. I want to say one thing on the Forest Rights Act, because it's very important, and Leo mentioned it. In fact, very, very tragically, the non-extension of the Forest Rights Act to Jammu and Kashmir is one of the main reasons for the current horrific tragedy that has overtaken the Gujar Bakliwal community in Jammu and Kashmir. And the Forest Rights Act, they are traditionally forest dwellers. They have been really evicted from the forest because they have got no titles, which they could have had the Forest Rights Act been extended to J&K. Now, the Forest Rights Act divides the environmental community, and I hope we recognize this. There are environmentalists who think that the Forest Rights Act is the single biggest disaster to overtake Indian forests and Indian wildlife. And there are Indian environmentalists who believe that the Forest Rights Act is absolutely essential for a more sustainable model of forest management. Oh, sorry. My phone is always on mute. I don't know what happened to this. I think this debate is continuing. This debate is very much continuing. And I think we should recognize that it is creating conditions in which the government is able to say there is no consensus, so we will override the provisions of the Forest Rights Act. So what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years is actually a substantial dilution, not by legal changes of the act, but by just the process of attrition. So a lot of the rights are not being settled. A lot of claims are not being settled. I myself, day before yesterday, I went to a village. It is on the outskirts. Ravi will know this area very well. It's on the outskirts of the Bhadra Tiger Reserve, and there are 200 families, scheduled caste families, who have been served eviction orders by the Forest Department. I asked them, how long have you been living here? They've got evidence that they've been living there for 3 generations, which is what the Act says. But they have not got the Forest Rights Act. They have not got the pattas. And the local environmentalists in Chikmagalur are delighted that they have not got the pattas. But I think that this is a gross injustice to them, because the law gives them that right. So on the Forest Rights Act, I just want to make this point, that this is a deeply divisive issue. The Forest Department is dead against the Forest Rights Act. It's the whole thing. The Forest Rights Act was actually pushed by people who were outside the Forest Department. There was no forester. And as long as I was Minister for Environment and Forests, I had to fight the forest bureaucracy for taking this Forest Rights Act very seriously. But now I think the forest bureaucracy is fighting back and coming back. Ease of doing business is the buzzword. And environmental regulation is seen to be a speed breaker in the ease of doing business. If you remove some of these regulations, our ranking will go up from 100 to 70. And the Prime Minister loves nothing other than an improvement in our global rankings. We have gone up from 140 to 100, and if you tweak a little laws here and there, we'll go up, I'm sure, from 100 to 70, if not lower in that scale. But these are difficult times, and there is very clearly a dominant theology that environmental regulation is a cost that is imposed on business, that this is a cost that India should not be paying at this stage of its development. It's a cost that we may pay 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's not something that we should be paying now. But we have to keep fighting. I'm a great believer that there are enough forces in this country, there are enough forums in this country, parliament, legislatures, where these issues do get raised, and you can have very unlikely allies. Leo mentioned BT Brinjal. It's 8 years since the moratorium was imposed, and the government has not been able to remove the moratorium. And one of the reasons why they have not been able to remove the moratorium, is because the RSS is dead against genetically modified crops. So all part of the RSS as far as environment is concerned. Sometimes saffron is very pro-green, and in the case of the RSS, it's absolutely, I found it absolutely interesting that, the guys landed up in my house and said, 8 साल हो गया है और 10 साल ये moratorium लगेगा. We will not allow BT mustard, we will not allow BT, cabbage, we will not allow India to have genetically modified crops. So you have various allies whose voice, if it is raised, governments will be forced to listen. So the situation is not as bleak as we think it is. So these are some of my initial remarks. And if you want to do it thematically, you want to ask people to, I have all the time in the world. He's the election guy. I'm not the election guy, so I can.
I'm moderating actually.
Oh, you're moderating.
Yeah. Okay.
So let Rajiv moderate, and then we can take questions.
Thank you to my senior colleague Jairam Ramesh. Since we've jumped right into these issues, I wanted to flag an issue that about a bill that came up in Parliament some years ago, and these are not usually considered in the context of your typical environmental impacts. This